for coming this evening, and thank you to Fudan for organising this talk. The Bentham Project was established in 1959 in order to produce the new definitive, or rather authoritative edition of the collected works of Jeremy Bentham. So we are not publishing everything that Bentham wrote, but only coherent works, plus his correspondence, letters to and from Bentham. We have to date published 35 or 36 volumes in the edition, and overall there will be perhaps 85 by the time we've finished. It's a massive undertaking, partly based on works that Bentham published himself during his lifetime, and partly on Bentham's unpublished manuscripts. And there are about 100,000 pages of Bentham's unpublished manuscripts in the libraries at UCL and the British Library. I think there are probably, at least in the West, only two comparable projects, or one of the comparable projects to the Bentham project, and that's the Marx Engels edition, which is being produced in Berlin. So it's very, well, it's not quite unique, and the Marx Engels edition, but it's extremely unusual to have such a major philosopher writing this so little is known and so little is introduced in reliable authoritative form. Bentham's adult career, and as you can see, he was born in 1748 and died in 1832. His adult career can be conveniently divided into three stages. The first dates from his coming of age in 1769, when he was 21 years old, through to the outbreak of the French Revolution in 1789, when his major endeavour was to produce a penal code based on the principle of utility, which led him to think about the fundamentals of legal philosophy. The second stage of his career, from the early years of the French Revolution through to 1803, was dominated by his attempts to build the Panopticon prison. And in the wake of his disappointment, when finally informed that the British government would not proceed with the Panopticon, by his work on the law of evidence and law reform more generally. Then the third stage of his career, from 1809 to his death in 1832, was marked by political radicalism, when he came to advocate representative democracy as the only form of government that might possibly promote the welfare of the people as a whole, rather than the welfare of rulers. So this threefold division, while helpful, doesn't capture the full complexity of Bentham's thinking and his intellectual development, not by a long way. So let me take the 1810s, for instance. These were an extraordinary decade in terms of the breadth and scope of Bentham's writings. He began the decade writing on parliamentary reform and eventually published Plan of Parliamentary Reform, the first utilitarian defence of democracy, in 1817. He lambasted the Church of England and its educational policies in Church of Englandism and its Catechism Examined, which was printed in 1817, published in 1818, while developing his own educational ideas in Chrestomathea, the term he took from the Greek to mean useful learning. And this was printed in 1815, published in 1817, and here he explained, and at the similar time he was writing another important essay, A Table of the Springs of Action, in which he explained the connection between pain and pleasure on the one hand, and motivation and ethics on the other. This work was related to contemporaneous writings on ethics generally, which, together with a table of the springs of action, have been published in our volume Deontology. He composed the bulk of the work, later published as the Book of Fallacies, in which he exposed the types of misleading arguments adopted by politicians. Again, in 1817, he published papers relative to codification and public instruction, putting forward his agenda addressed, amongst others, to the Emperor of Russia and to the President and Governors of the United States for the codification of the laws. There were also a number of works that Bentham did not print or publish himself, including his writings on sexual morality that have recently appeared in our volume of Sexual Irregularities, and the material which I'm going to explore in this talk, namely his essay on logic, in which he considered the foundational issues of thought and action, and which date from the summer and autumn of 1814. And he wrote this material at this house, Ford Abbey, which he rented for 4 years between 1814 and 1818. And if you're ever in the United Kingdom, I highly recommend a visit to Ford Abbey, a beautiful house and still very much in the condition in which it was when Bentham was living and working there. It's a place which makes you want to do philosophy, I think. But in this work essay on logic, as I say, written in 1814, it's worth noting that Bentham was not so much developing new ideas, but rather articulating in much greater detail ideas that he had long held, and indeed had possibly held in outline at least, and I think this is the extraordinary part, since his teenage years. And I've long been convinced that in order to understand the depth and originality of Bentham's thought, we shouldn't begin with the principle of utility, but with his writings on logic and language. Now, this element of Bentham's thought was seriously mislabelled by Charles K. Ogden as Bentham's theory of fictions, and that description has misled scholars and produced much misunderstanding of Bentham's philosophy. Now, I'm now working on a new authoritative edition of Bentham's writings on logic and language, and tonight I'll try to explain the relationship between Essay on Logic and the two works I've mentioned written about the same time. The first, Chrestomathea, Bentham's writings on education, and the second, Deontology, his writings on ethics, and thereby explain the relationship between logic, language, the arts and sciences, which together he called disciplines, and ethics. So let me, before I get onto the substantive part of the lecture, give an explanation of Bentham's use of the terms arts, sciences, and disciplines. Science referred to knowledge, and art referred to practice, and every subject had its science and its art. Hence, we might say that the science of political economy concerned its theory, whereas the art of political economy included the measures taken by government with a view to increase wealth. And the term discipline was the collective term for an art and science together. So we have the discipline of political economy would be comprised of both science and art. So a science was characterised by those activities which involved the acquisition or attempt to acquire knowledge, that is, to quote Bentham, correct conceptions and judgments on the subject in question, while an art consisted in the performance of operations of the practical class. Now, I'm going to talk about Bentham's engagement with Aristotle. Now, Bentham scholars in recent years have given a great deal of attention to Bentham's views on logic and language, but the focus has been very much on the essay known as Of Ontology. And here Bentham discussed, amongst other things, the names of real and fictitious entities and the technique of paraphrasis, by which the meaning of the names of fictitious entities was expounded through their relationship to the names of real entities. Fictitious entities are abstractions, real entities, things that we can perceive, real objects. Now, by focusing on real and fictitious entities, we may have overlooked the broader picture, which concerns the relationship of logic and language to the field of learning generally, to the arts and sciences or disciplines, including ethics, and hence to well-being or happiness. So in this talk, I hope to paint, or at least contribute a few brushstrokes towards this broader picture. I'll argue that Bentham's views on logic and ethics were a product of his engagement with and response to Aristotle, not indeed the most authentic versions of the texts attributed to Aristotle, though Bentham did read them in the ancient Greek, but rather with the Aristotelian tradition as it was received at the University of Oxford and as it was taught to Bentham. Bentham had entered, in their technical language, matriculated at the University of Oxford, at Queen's College, Oxford, when he was 12 years old. This was October 1760. Reputedly the youngest person at that time ever to have gone up to an English university. And by the summer of 1761, he has studied logic through Robert Sanderson's Logicae Artis Compendium, a textbook on the art of logic. Sanderson's textbook, his compendium, were being first published in 1618, so 150 years earlier. But it remained the standard textbook on the subject, on logic, until the end of the 18th century. The work was a Latin distillation of Aristotle's Organon, the main writings of logic by Aristotle. Bentham's engagement with Aristotle continued beyond logic into ethics, when Bentham again took the standard University of Oxford textbook, the work called Ethices Compendium, in English, the Ethical Compendium for the Use of Academic Youth by means of the Aristotelian method of argumentation. So he took this work, again, as his point of departure for his own views on ethics. Let's go back to young Jeremy, because in the essay on logic, again, that's written in 1814, Bentham described his encounter with Sanderson's Aristotle when he was, I quote, a youth, or rather a child, at college. As he described this encounter as follows: of the notions therein delivered, that is in Sanderson, some he, referring to himself, Bentham himself, some he found continually applicable, and applicable with advantage to ordinary practice. These treasured themselves up in his mind. In the logic of Aristotle, he found a considerable number of the tools or instruments which he has had to work with. So a positive attitude towards some of these tools provided by Aristotle. But he goes on to say, he never regarded Aristotle's opinions, or anyone else's for that matter, as, I quote, the standard or criterion of truth. In effect, he had thought for himself. Bentham then had been a mere 13 years old when he had studied at Sanderson's Aristotle on logic, yet so profound had been that youthful encounter that, as I hope to show, it structured his essay on logic, composed over 50 years later. He explained that by comparing his views with those of the Aristotelians, mutual light would be cast on both, while, I quote, the extent as well as direction of the progress made, should any be found to have been made, by the modern one, in other words by Bentham himself, will be the more clearly discernible. This, I'm going to go on now and look at Bentham's definition of logic, and I've shown you there a picture of the manuscripts on which this talk tonight is based, a typical Bentham manuscript, and it's the first page of Bentham's essay on logic. Bentham contrasted his own definition of logic with that of Sanderson. Bentham argued that Sanderson's definition was deficient in two major respects. First, that it concerned only knowledge, and second, that it did not link logic to well-being or happiness. So Bentham defined logic as the art which has for its object or end in view, and notice it's an art, it's a practice, is the art which has for its object or end in view the giving to the best advantage, direction to the human mind, and thence to the whole human frame, in its pursuit of any object or purpose, to the attainment of which it is capable of being applied. He argued that his definition was the first one in the history of the world, in which the relation of logic, and I quote, to practical use in any shape has been held up to view. This word use, similar derivation to the word utility. Sanderson had defined logic as follows. Logic, which is also called by Synecdoche dialectics, is the art of reasoning, or it is the art which is instrumental in directing our minds towards knowledge of all things which can be known. This word Synecdoche, it might even be pronounced Synecdoche, I don't know. It's a very unusual word which we don't use very much, but it's when you take the name of a part and use it to represent the whole. So typically writers at Bentham's time would say, use the term man to refer to the whole of mankind, of the whole of humankind. Anyway, Sanderson's reference to dialectics, which was the art of disputation, as an alternative name for logic, noted Bentham, was, as he says, a very inauspicious commencement for a treatise on the art which, in one of its most useful branches, is the art of correct expression, since if logic and the art of disputation were names for one and the same thing, then so were the names for a tree and a branch of that tree. So in terms of extent, Bentham says Sanderson's formal definition fell far short of his own. But in the observation that followed the definition, namely that logic was an instrument directing our minds towards knowledge, an extent, says Bentham, is assigned to it much more ample, falling little, if anything, short of the extent ascribed to it by Bentham himself. This account of Sanderson's, which linked logic to the accumulation of knowledge, was, however, seriously deficient, since in point of utility, knowledge was inferior to art, and, he says Bentham, so much so that separated from art, all the knowledge which the human mind is capable of containing is of no use. Given that the only thing that had value in itself was happiness, so logic, if it were to have any value, must, says Bentham, in some way or other be in every part conducive to happiness, and it is only insofar as it is so conducive that it is worth knowing. Aristotle and the Greek philosophers in general, however, seem to value knowledge more than happiness itself, or something from which happiness would follow as of course. Yet, asked Bentham, what value did knowledge have unless it led to happiness? His answer, just nothing. And it was in this context that we find one of the handful of references in Bentham to Kant. And Bentham says, look for sense in Kant, look for a knot in a bulrush. You know, bulrush is a very straight plant. So even though the Aristotelians pretended that they aimed for the knowledge of things, their endeavours were directed to a much more limited object, namely the import or meaning of words. The point for the Aristotelians was to demonstrate to an opponent in debate that there was a coincidence between the import or meaning of two words. They had mistakenly assumed that each word had, I quote, an import naturally inherent in it, whereas it was now clearly understood that the connection between a word and its import is altogether arbitrary, the result of tacit convention and long continued usage. Of course, Bentham is drawing on Locke, for instance, here. They had also assumed for each word there must be a correspondent, really existing thing. Nevertheless, there had been some benefit from dialectics in that it gave a discourse a form in which it became clear on which points two persons agreed and on which they disagreed. However, the only means by which real knowledge was obtainable, counted Bentham, was through observation, experiment, and experience, what we think of as scientific method. But what if it were objected, noted Bentham, that on his view, an institute of the art of logic and a complete encyclopedia, at any rate if the encyclopedia be a methodical one, are one and the same thing. This work of yours, if it be what it professes to be, is therefore an encyclopedia, and that as complete as well as a methodical one. In fact, Bentham puts this forward as an objection, but he goes on to say this is exactly the extent that he gives, or he gave, to logic. Like an encyclopedia, an institute of logic should deal with the whole field of art and science, and indeed with the whole field of thought and action. The difference lay only in the degree of generality. An encyclopedia would give a complete survey, whereas a work on logic would give no more than a general outline. That is, the principal divisions of the field, together with here and there a hint, such as may happen to be suggested by a comparative and bird's eye view, and thence in some sort a commanding view for the more advantageous culture of it. So logic was distinct from every other discipline in that its field of action included the different fields of action of every other discipline. As he put it, and I quote, handmaid, or rather governess, to each individual art and science, logic beholds comprehended within her all-comprehensive empire the particular domain of each. Logic is the emperor which rules over all these different communities. And Bentham claimed that no one else before him had ever considered logic in such a comprehensive fashion. And Bentham's account of the scope of logic is the key to understanding the connection he saw between logic and ethics. Given that every art and science was included within the field of logic, then so was the art and science of ethics. And I'll try and show the exact place that Bentham assigns to ethics a little further on. But now let's move to Aristotle versus Bentham. Sanderson began his account of logic with the praecognita, which literally translated means things foreknown, identified by Aristotle. And Bentham organised his discussion through a critique of Aristotle's praecognita, and indeed Aristotle's predicaments and post-predicaments. And Bentham put forward in opposition 8 characteristics of his own. Now Bentham, as a critique of Sanderson's account of the praecognita, the predicaments and the post-predicaments, which I'm not going to go into here, but rather focus on several of Bentham's own characteristics of logic. And there I've listed them. The first, the general end in view. The second, the field of exercise. The third, operations. 4, faculties. 5, instrument. 6, uses. And 7, functions. Now for Bentham, his aim was to give a coherent and consistent account of the whole field of thought and action, and to organise it in a way that was most conducive to the promotion of well-being, of happiness, of utility. I'll not go through systematically each of Bentham's characteristics, but will draw attention to some key points. So for Bentham, the general end in view of logic, as we've already seen, was well-being. In other words, happiness. In other words, a balance of pleasure over pain. Just as it was the end in view of all human action, including, for instance, medicine or cookery. Just like every other art and science, logic was of no value except and insofar as it tended to diminish pain and increase pleasure. It was, and I quote, in this tendency to a common end that the cementing principle or common bond of relation by which the several arts and sciences are connected with each other will be viewed, and from this common bond of connection will be deduced such a plan of encyclopedical arrangement as should naturally be more interesting than any that which has hitherto made its appearance. From Bentham's definition of logic, it followed that its field of exercise, the second characteristic, embraced, again as we have seen, the field of every other art and science. Now the third characteristic concerned operations, in other words, the mental operations that could be applied to every art, and for which the relevant term was often used to describe the operation itself, as well as the faculty of the mind, which was represented as performing the operation in question. There were a great many of these operations, noted Bentham, and in order, he says, to give a clear and distinct idea of the nature and differential character of each, he distributed them into distinct classes, starting with the most simple, and that is those which, for their explanation, don't require reference to any of the others, and then going looking at the more complex ones. And I'm not going to go into details here, but the most simple operation was perception. The second was slightly more complicated, was recollection, the processes associated with the memory. The third was judgment, which included things like comparison and examination. The fourth was abstraction. The fifth category, methodization, which I'm going to say more about. And the sixth was discourse, or language, which again I will say more about. Now, Bentham referred to methodization as the master operation from which all other operations, and especially discourse, and I quote, are wont to receive direction and assistance, while discourse, as we shall see, formed a characteristic of its own, was employed in each and every one of these operations. So Bentham regarded methodization, or an arrangement, putting things into order, as by far the most important operation of logic, and so much so that the art of method covered almost the whole of the field of logic itself, with the remaining mental operations being so many instruments in its hands. And Bentham's illustrated the importance of arrangement quite simply by reference to the placing of numbers in order. That's 1 is followed by 2 is followed by 3, the so-called numeration table. And if you don't have such an ordering of numbers, common arithmetic is impossible. So methodization, noted Bentham, could be applied to both objects and to discourse. In relation to objects, Bentham divided methodization into what he calls successive aggregation and connected aggregation. The objects in question could be either physical entities, things, like this bottle, or psychical entities, ideas. Though in the case of psychical entities, you can't arrange the objects themselves. All you can arrange is their names. Successive aggregation was where objects were presented in order of priority and posteriority, in other words, before and after, in terms of either time or place. You know, what comes first in time and then what follows, or you can organise something in terms of where it's placed and then where the next item is placed in relation to it. Now, in connected, that's successive aggregation. In connected aggregation, we imagine the objects as being presented all together. You imagine them as being placed in a box. The distinction between genus and species follows from connected aggregation. The division of an aggregate, that is, taking the contents of the box and distributing its contents into two boxes, gives rise to what Bentham calls scales of aggregates or scales of logical subalternation. So an example of logical subalternation is the famous Porphyrion tree on this, my side of the diagram. This begins with substance as the genus generalissimum, the most general genus, of which the first division consisted of body, the second of living thing, the third of animal, the fourth of man, and the fifth of individual men, Plato and Socrates and Aristotle. Now, definition per genus et differentium, the traditional Aristotelian method, applied according to the exhaustive method of division which Bentham took from the theory of the Aristotelians, if not their practice, was a vital element in Bentham's own thought. As he explained, from every such definition there resulted a bifurcate division. The greater aggregate, he says, is divided into two forks or arms. In the traditional Aristotelian practice, however, a name signifying a property was given to one of the arms. Man is a rational animal, for instance, but no such property was given to the other arm, to the rest. And so the former, to which a property was assigned, was placed in the light, while the latter was left in the dark. So what Bentham said was that you should attribute a property to each of the arms, and then both arms are placed, at least as nearly as may be, in an equally strong light. So an example of this method was his division of entities into physical and psychical. So you start with entities, physical and psychical, and then both into real entities and fictitious entities. Then you take real, don't worry about this, he divided real psychical entities into those present to perception and those present to memory, and the latter into simple ideas and general ideas, that is, an aggregate formed by abstraction. So that's just one example of him using this exhaustively bifurcate method, bifurcate, splitting into two. Well, let me just say a little bit about Bentham's, I shall come back to that, Bentham's fifth characteristic, the main instrument of logic, was discourse or language. Bentham says, grand instrument of thought in general and of thought directed to the purposes of logic in particular, the faculty of discourse, including the faculty of speech. The faculty of speech was just one of several modes of communication, and the term language was applied to designate the assemblage of audible signs, says Bentham, of which with or without a correspondent collection of visible signs or characters, the faculty of discourse is composed. Bentham distinguished between the transitive and intransitive modes in which language was used, the former being the application of language to the mind of some person other than the person by whom they were employed, that's the transitive mode, and the latter being its application to the mind of that person alone. This is terminology taken from grammar, from verbs, where verbs are said to be transitive or intransitive. Transitive when the action applies to someone else apart from the actor, intransitive when they just apply to the actor themselves. So, language was, says Bentham, an instrument not only of discourse but of thought itself. An instrument by which not only are perceptions and ideas communicated, but ideas formed. An instrument without the aid of which a man would neither be able to communicate to other minds any part of the thoughts of which the stock of his own mind is constituted, but without which the greatest stock of those possessions which it would be possible to communicate, with which his own mind, would be furnished, would be but in an inconsiderable degree more ample than that with which the mind of the species of animal, be it what it may, which in the scale of perfection approaches the nearest to his own, is commonly provided. There's a brilliant idea of why Bentham's so difficult to study, because that's less than one sentence. But what he's saying is that without language, not only would we not be able to communicate any better than animals, such as a dog or a horse, but we wouldn't even be able to think. So language was the master instrument of logic, with which it does everything that it does, says Bentham, and without which the utmost which it would be capable of doing would in comparison be next to nothing. Hence, before considering how logic could be helpful to any other art and science, it would be necessary, says Bentham, to enter into a separate study of the nature of language. And so a significant part of the essay on logic is concerned with language and its improvement. But suffice it to say that in relation to language, the use of logic, which included the art and science of grammar, was to correct errors in the structure of propositions and to clarify the import of words. The point was to bring clarity and exactitude to discourse. And Bentham writes a significant amount of text on these matters. But alas, we don't have. I don't have time to say much about those, except to bring you another quote where Bentham says, "Without language, not only would men have been incapable of communicating, each man, his own thoughts to other men, but compared with what in the existing state of things he possesses, the stock of his own ideas would, in point of number, have been as nothing, while each of them, taken by itself, would have been indeterminate and flitting." Without language to anchor our thoughts, thoughts would come into our head and go out and be lost. So language, in fact, was a vital component. It was in an eminent degree subservient to all the mental operations that Bentham had identified, and hence we needed to think about language. Bentham's seventh characteristic was functions, jobs. And this consisted in learning, using or applying, teaching and improving the art and science in question. So there were three operations applicable to every discipline, namely to teach, to learn and to invent. And there existed a reciprocal relationship between teaching and invention. the art of invention might be taught, while the art of teaching might be the subject of invention. In the order of time, invention must have come first, since whatever was taught must have been invented before it could have been taught. And the very act of communicating involved teaching, since the transitive use of language, by definition, involved the communication, or at least the attempt to communicate, information, and thereby to teach. In common discourse, teaching had a more restrictive meaning, whereby, and I quote, conveying information in some shape, in which the possession of it is a mark of superiority, the demand for it of inferiority, and in which neither the reception nor the communication of it is altogether unattended with exertion and difficulty. In other words, we professors are superior, you students are inferior, and we're giving you a hard time. So learning was the counterpart of teaching. Right, I'm going to move on now to Bentham's encyclopedic tree in relation to the disciplines and the arts and sciences. So we're now in a better position to appreciate Bentham's conception of the whole field of arts and sciences. Remember, it's not just of knowledge. No point to knowledge if you don't put it into practice. Bentham argued that in order to understand the proper scope for an encyclopedia, it was necessary to distinguish in the first place between the field of arts and sciences, or disciplines, and that of the general occupations of life, and then between the field of art and the field of science. In fact, says Bentham, there's no determinate boundary between the field of art and science and the remainder of the field of thought and action. And insofar as any difference might be said to exist, it only did so, he says, in the state of mind of those by whom the part in question is cultivated. So there's a sort of certain arrogance amongst professors as to the fact that their discipline is somehow superior to the actions of common life. But of course, what counts for Bentham is the degree of happiness that those actions bring. Now, in effect, says Bentham, where the performance of an operation was presumed to require study, in other words, involved attention and labour, it was said to constitute an art or science, depending respectively upon whether some further action was undertaken or whether the point was solely the acquisition of knowledge. And there was no limit to the number of disciplines. New disciplines could be created by subdividing existing disciplines, and my word, don't we know how that happens? Or by taking some operation from the waste of ordinary and undenominated practice and transplanted it into the enclosed and cultivated field of discipline. And this, he doesn't say it here, but it's one of Bentham's ideas is what he calls archetypation. And this is how our minds work, through using the physical world to understand abstractions. So we talk about, let's say, the field of knowledge or the field of disciplines, and you imagine a sort of a farm, and the philosophers in one field, and over the fence are the lawyers, and somewhere over there are the historians, and maybe on the far side of the farm are the scientists. So, this is how our minds operate. And you think about the prepositions we use, at least in English, and in, on, to, for, they all involve physical relationships. But anyway, that's by the by. So we have our, he says, you can take, ordinary practice, what some people are doing, let's say traditional farming, and bring that into the field of disciplines by applying scientific methods to crop rotation, development of seed, and so forth. Anyway, The bond of connection, he says, between the various disciplines, or rather the most instructive bond of connection, was their relation to well-being, a point we've already heard. Aristotle had stated, again as we've seen, that logic was concerned with the accumulation of knowledge. But, said Bentham, let us now add in its road to happiness. Happiness was the standard by which the value of knowledge would be assessed. Now, Bentham's encyclopedical table, or art and science table, which appears in his work Chrestomathea, his work on education, carries a subtitle exhibiting the first lines of a tabular diagram of the principal and most extensive branches of art and science, framed in the exhaustively bifurcate mode. Bentham's term for the whole field of art and science, which had, as we have seen, well-being for its end in view, was eudaimonics, from the Greek. Well-being, he explained, included the notion of being. He then suggested that the term eudaimonics might be applied to the art of well-being and the term ontology applied to the science. Now, from this overarching field, Bentham divided the whole of art and science according to the exhaustively bifurcate method, drawing on the ancient Greek language to coin new terms for the respective divisions, though also kindly providing explanations in English, on the grounds that the existing terminology, for instance, in England at the time, we had natural history and natural philosophy, and you wouldn't know it, but natural history meant what we would now call life sciences, natural philosophy, what we would call physical sciences. Bentham said that that existing terminology was confused and misleading. Whether you think his new terminology is any better, I'll leave you to judge. So the first division was between koenoscopic eudaimonics, in other words, regarding properties common to all beings, and ideoscopic eudaimonics, regarding properties peculiar to different classes of beings. These words have never taken off in English. And the first division, the former division, was metaphysics or ontology, in the ordinary acceptation of the word, says Bentham. But it was from the latter division that Bentham derived the bulk of the arts and sciences. And the first such subdivision was between body-regarding disciplines, which was further subdivided into the fields of mathematics and the natural sciences on the one hand, and the mind-regarding disciplines on the other. Logic, language, or more broadly communication, and ethics were included in the mind-regarding disciplines. So let's look in a little bit more detail at the bottom right-hand corner. So how did logic relate to ethics, asked Bentham, since the end in view of both was well-being? Both logic and ethics were concerned with promoting happiness. Logic, Bentham explained, was the more general art and ethics the more particular. If in the pursuit of well-being, he says, it be the province of ethics to take the direction of human conduct, in that same pursuit it is the province of logic to take the command and give direction to the course of ethics itself. From having his generals under him, the commander-in-chief has not the less the command of the army committed to his care. So you see, logic as the commanding-in-chief, ethics one of his generals. And ethics appears in Bentham's encyclopedical table, as I said, as a subfield of mind regarding ontology, and is itself divided into expository and sensorial branches. Expository, what is; sensorial, what ought to be; and the latter branch, the sensorial branch, termed deontology, a word derived from the ancient Greek and meaning knowledge concerning what is proper to be done. Ironically, that word, coined by Bentham, is now used to refer to those approaches which are contrasted with consequentialism, of which utilitarianism is one. But the word deontology was invented by Bentham. And deontology, Bentham then divides into public and private ethics, and the former, public ethics into internal government and international politics, and so forth. Now, in the logic writings of 1814, Bentham discussed ethics in some detail. As noted above, Bentham has stated that in a work of logic, a bird's eye view should be given of the various arts and sciences. Now, it's possible that Bentham was intending to give such an outline of the field of ethics in Essay on Logic, but though the surviving manuscripts do not constitute a complete account, in some respects they go beyond a bird's eye view. Now, it's typical of Bentham, once he had started a subject, to try to cover it fully, but then abandon it because some other scheme that he considered more pressing had arisen. So Bentham's life is characterised by one incomplete work after another. But to look at what he says in the essay on logic, the writings he did write, he divides the field of private ethics into the virtues of prudence, probity, and beneficence. And he says, under one or other of these denominations are comprised every human quality conducive to human happiness. So these three virtues together covered the whole field of ethics, and all of the virtues were resolvable into these three. Prudence concerned the well-being of the actor, him or herself, and hence was self-regarding, while probity and beneficence concerned the well-being of persons other than the actor, him or herself, and hence were other-regarding. Probity was the virtue where the actor was under an obligation to perform the action in question. That's an obligation arising from some sanction, some law, from public opinion, maybe from religion. Whereas benevolence was the virtue where there was no such obligation. In other words, where you were nice to other people from your own free will, because you're a nice person. In all cases, the virtue consisted in preferring a greater good on its coming into competition with a less. In the case of the other regarding virtue, for instance, a person would give up or sacrifice a lesser portion of good which he or she might have received for the sake of producing a greater portion of good for another, receivable by another person or number of persons. Good, Bentham pointed out, might be understood in a positive or a negative sense. In the positive case, he says the virtue consists in the forbearance to possess or enjoy some lot or lots of positive pleasure. In the negative sense, in a man subjecting himself to some lot or lots of positive pain. You give up some pleasure, or else you suffer some inconvenience or some pain. And in short, he says, were it not for pain and pleasure, there would be no such thing as virtue, and it was only insofar as it prevented pain or produced pleasure that virtue was of any value. Again, the critique of Aristotle, or rather the Aristotelian tradition as received at the University of Oxford, was Bentham's point of comparison with his own views. He contrasted his own notion of virtue, which consisted in well-being, with that of Aristotle or his Oxford disciple, as Bentham says, that is the author of the Ethices Compendium, the textbook of ethics, who claimed that virtue consisted in mediocritas, the Latin word meaning mediocrity, though, noted Bentham, the more congruous interpretation was moderation. So the Aristotelian virtues are meant to be in a halfway place between two vices. So, for instance, bravery is the virtue, the evil on one side is cowardice, and on the other side is rashness. So, bravery occupies a middle position. Now, the compendialist, the Oxford compendialist, says Bentham, names the virtue in question and then names or describes the quality in which the virtue was deficient and in which it was excessive, but without any indication as to the quantity by which one could recognise whether what was proposed was vicious, because there was either too much of it or too little of it. Worded courage worded bravery or courage become cowardice. Worded it become rashness. This, says Bentham, was the equivalent to a medical practitioner to a doctor who, without giving the symptoms of the diseases, should content himself with giving their names. Bentham proposed to go through the list of names of the virtues given by Aristotle and through him by the moralists of modern times in order to show that they were related to his own virtues of prudence, probity and beneficence. In the event, Bentham did not, in fact, discuss the whole catalogue of Aristotelian virtues as they appeared in the Ethices Compendium, though he did discuss, to a greater or lesser extent, prudence, fortitude, temperance, justice, veracity and amity. And if you take justice for an example, Bentham began with a general critique of the overlap in the various Aristotelian virtues before arguing that justice and probity were almost equivalent to each other, with the only difference being not logical or ethical, but grammatical. And he says, the occasions on which they are capable of being employed, the actions of which they are capable of being predicated are the same, but for the being respectively made up into sentences, the sets of concomitant and concordant words required by them are every here and there different. Everybody says, I will do to you justice. Nobody says, I will do you probity. So it was better to use the term probity to express the primary virtue rather than the term justice, because of the use of justice as a substitute to the term judicature. Of them, says Bentham, by whom judicature, a judge, what a judge does is exercised, a legal judge, it's commonly said that he administers justice. It would not, however, be said that he administers probity. Anyway, you'll be pleased to hear that I've come to my conclusion. So in this talk, I've attempted to describe the connections that Bentham saw between logic, language, the arts and sciences, and ethics, with a view to understanding the relationship between his writings on logic, on education as published in Chrestomathea, and on ethics as published in Deontology. A prominent theme has been his encounter with Aristotle, or rather the Aristotelian tradition as it was received at the University of Oxford. Bentham's own views were formed in response to the Aristotelian praecognita, predicaments and post-predicaments, the method of definition per genus et differentiam, the virtues and the Porphyrian tree. The key features in Bentham's logic were his characteristics and the encyclopedical tree, where he outlined the relationship according to the method of exhaustive bifurcation between the various disciplines under the general heading of well-being, categorised as the science of ontology and the art of eudaimonics. Logic was one branch of the encyclopedical tree, but its techniques were applicable across the whole range of the disciplines. The instrument of logic was language, or more expansively, discourse, which was both the vehicle of thought and the means of communication. Without language, there would be no thought, and hence no arts and sciences. Logic and language, therefore, were ubiquitous across the arts and sciences. Moreover, arts and sciences were the subjects of teaching, learning, and invention, which formed the functions of logic, and hence we have the link in Bentham's thought between logic and education. One final point is worth remarking in relation to the emergence and development of Bentham's thought. It's still not clear to us exactly why, when or how Bentham, having been brought up in an extremely conservative manner, became such a radical thinker. And Bentham has tended to perplex intellectual historians. The great intellectual historian J.G.A. Pocock once wrote that he had no idea which planet Bentham came from. You know, how did Bentham suddenly emerge on the scene in the middle of the 18th century? And in a sense, what I've said today makes things even more remarkable, because I think I presented evidence that Bentham was already a free thinker, if not on his arrival at Oxford, age 12, then very soon afterwards. First, he tells us in one of his early works, A Fragment on Government, he attended, when he was 16 years old, the lectures of William Blackstone, the great leading authority of English law, and he says he listened with rebel ears. I think that's a wonderful phrase, to listen with rebel ears. I hope you listen to me and your teachers with rebel ears. Second, at the same age, in order to take his degree, he was compelled to subscribe to the 39 Articles of the Church of England. This is the statement of doctrine of the Church. And despite his objections to their content, he did subscribe, but he so resented this episode that when he wrote Church of Englandism and its Catechism Examined, he wrote that 50 years later in the mid-1810s, he regarded it as an expiation, a putting right of a wrong. And third, I've argued tonight that Bentham's most fundamental philosophical views, including those on ethics, were a product of his engagement with the two Aristotelian compends that he studied at Oxford. And so the attempt to cram Bentham's mind with orthodoxy paradoxically led to his lifelong endeavour to develop new ideas in the fields of philosophy, religion, ethics and law, and eventually politics, culminating in a profound critique of the British state in virtually all its aspects. Thank you very much indeed for your attention.